The morning in Asheville was cool despite the calendar summer. The air over the hills was rich with moisture, and the sky was washed out, clear, without a single cloud. Cars with ribbons, balloons, and windows painted with the words, "We did it," and the names of graduates stretched down the narrow street leading to the school stadium. Parents in smart clothes hurried by with bouquets, candy, soda cans, and folding chairs on their shoulders. Some were nervously adjusting their son's tie. Someone was squabbling in the parking lot, unable to hide their excitement. For everyone, the day was the culmination of years invested in homework, trips to practice, and parent-teacher conference nights. But one woman was driving there for a very different reason. An old Ford Crown Victoria, dark green, slightly tinted near the rear fender, parked neatly in the shade at the opposite end of the school playground. Behind the wheel was Martha Daniels. 60 years old, with short-cropped hair the color of salt and pepper, wearing a khaki jacket that sat as naturally on her as it did on others' a party dress. On her lapel gleamed an old worn brooch in the shape of a serpent wielding a sword, the symbol of the Army medical staff. The brooch was barely visible, almost worn away by time, but she wore it anyway. Not for show. Just because she had to. Like she used to wear it before a tour of duty in a field hospital. Before going into a high-risk area. Martha had only lived in Asheville for 3 months. After her sister invited her to move closer to her family. Hardly anyone knew her here. She didn't go to church on Sundays, didn't show up at local fundraisers, didn't interact with neighbors beyond a minute's conversation at the mailbox. To many, she was just another old woman in a big house with a dog bowl by the porch and a light in the window until late at night. No one knew who she was before this town. And she was fine with that. The stadium was filled in advance. Parents, grandmothers, younger siblings crowded under the huge white awnings. The sound of a saxophone came from the bleachers where the school band played before kickoff. A huge banner reading Class of 2025 shook in the wind, clinging to metal supports. Volunteers, underclassmen, students with badges and guest lists, crowded around the main entrance. In front of them was a stretched red ribbon with a sign that read, "VIP Family Entrance." Martha approached without undue haste. In her hand was an invitation card, printed on standard paper, the same one her son James had mailed to her with a short note inside. "Mom, if ever there was a day in your life you should come to, this is it." Martha handed the paper to the young girl at the front door. She glimpsed it, hesitated, began flipping through a spreadsheet on a clipboard. "Sorry, you're not on the VIP list. Maybe you're in the wrong zone. It's only for parents of honor students and honored guests." "I'm James Danielle's mother," Martha replied calmly. "Yes, I see," but he indicated another chaperone. The girl smiled strained. "Would you like to take a seat in the common section? To the right and down there." Martha didn't argue. She could already hear someone behind her whispering, "Who's that?" Probably a volunteer. She stepped aside, tucking the invitation back into her pocket. A couple minutes later, a guard approached her, a tall, full man in a security agency uniform with a shiny badge on his belt. "Ma'am, this area is not for public access," he said with neutral politeness. "I don't insist," Martha said quietly. "I was just leaving." She walked along the bleachers, past dozens of eyes that read everything no one had said out loud. Wrong clothes, wrong smile, wrong age, and certainly not the guest of honor look. She sat in the last row, against the wall, on a plastic folding chair, right in front of the stage entrance. Her face remained impenetrable. She sat with a straight back, palms on her knees, eyes fixed forward. The stage had a life of its own. Presenters rehearsed the words. Teachers were checking the rosters. The stage was getting ready for the party, but no one, absolutely no one, noticed the woman against the wall. And she did not seek attention. She already knew, her time was not in applause. Her time was to be there when no one else was. From the stage, the auditorium seemed huge, like a wave frozen at its peak before breaking into applause. Hundreds of people sat under the white awning, some smiling, some holding their phones at the ready, and some looking at the list of names on the program. James Daniel stood among the graduates in a black robe, with gold cords on his shoulders and a cap pulled down a little on the side. He held himself confidently, almost automatically, like an athlete before a race. But inside there was silence. Not excitement, not joy. Something else. Something that started the moment he cast his gaze deep into the hall and saw her. At the very end, against the wall, at the very edge of the reality of this celebration sat her. His mother. Martha. Straight back. The jacket he remembered from his elementary school graduation, and the brooch the same one he'd once tried to pry off with his fingernail when he was a kid. And the look. The same one she'd once sat with in the hospital room after his surgery, pretending to be calm when he was scared. He hadn't expected to see her there. She'd promised to come, but it was always like the wind with her. She could appear, she could disappear, but always discreetly, unobtrusively. He knew she never wanted to be at the center. And here she was, in the shadows again. And again with no right to be there. He remembered trying to figure out what she was doing as a child. There were no uniformed pictures in her house, no war stories, no crying evenings with a glass in her hand. She just came home. Silently. Sometimes with a tight bandage on her arm, sometimes with faded eyes. But she still got up first thing in the morning. She'd make his oatmeal. Ironed his shirts. When asked where she'd been, the short answer was on a business trip. Or, it was hot out there. Or, not everyone came back. He didn't understand. And even got angry when, at school nights, the other kids' moms would come in wearing dresses and carrying cameras, and his mother would stand in the shadow of the gym, in a uniform the color of dust, and be the first to leave. Now, looking at her at the end of the gym, he realized for the first time, she wasn't going to be in the foreground. Never. But what was happening now was more than her modesty. The district representative took the stage, a stout man in a suit, with a wide file and a badge on his lapel. He began to speak. About the accomplishments of the graduates, about the importance of leadership, about the future. His words sounded like background. James kept his cool. He even smiled when his name came over the speakers, announcing him as the recipient of an award for outstanding contributions to the school community. He took a step forward, preparing to step up to the microphone. And then he noticed movement in the auditorium. Near the back row, the same security guard his mother had encountered that morning was again arguing with a volunteer. He held the list in his hands and tried to explain something, but the guard was already leaning toward Martha. She didn't resist. She stood up slowly as if she was uncomfortable to continue sitting. As if this wasn't a conflict, but a formality. Something clicked in James's mind like a shutter in a camera. He didn't think, didn't plan. He simply stepped to the microphone without waiting for a diploma. The district spokesman tried to hold him back. James, wait, first we need. But he was already in front of the microphone. The buzz had died down. Even the orchestra stopped half-heartedly. There was something in his face that neither his teachers nor his classmates saw in him. A thin line of tension, almost rage but restrained. He looked directly into the hall. His eyes stopped on the security guard, on his mother, on the people who were watching, and not interfering. He picked up the microphone. Took a deep breath. I'm sorry. But I have to say something before I'm handed my diploma. For a second, everything froze. He could feel the air in the hall full of parents and officials getting thin. It was as if everyone realized, this wasn't going to go according to the script. It was at that moment that James felt, for the first time ever, that he was no longer just a graduate. He was a son. The son of a woman whose story had so far only been told in silence. The microphone hissed slightly as James adjusted it to his height. He stood on the stage and everything didn't seem as it should be. There was no applause, no cheering faces. Even the county representative stood off to the side confused, not realizing what was going on. James could feel everyone's eyes on him, but he didn't take his eyes off the hall. From the very spot at the end where his mother was still standing next to the guard. He knew that if he kept silent now, he would never forgive himself. He started tentatively, his voice trembling a little but growing stronger with each word. He wasn't reading a prepared speech. The paper with the beautiful phrases had been left in the pocket of his robe, and it seemed meaningless now. He was saying something that had lived in him for a long time, but had never been said out loud. He began simply by saying that he could not accept this award without naming the real leader in his life. There was absolute silence in the hall. People pulled away from their phones, from their conversations, from their thoughts. James didn't name a name right away. He was telling a story. A story he himself only partially recognized. One day when he was 12, he'd crawled under his bed looking for an old laptop and came across a metal box. He opened it, expecting to find documents or letters. Instead, dozens of awards, medals, patches. He remembered looking at them in the semi-darkness of the room, how his fingers had touched the cold metal with inscriptions that did not contain a single superfluous word. For rescue, for bravery, for carrying under fire. At the time he didn't understand it yet. He just felt it was important. When he showed the box to his mother, she took it from his hands calmly. She closed the lid and put it back under the bed. To his question she only replied, "It's not for display." He never saw her again. But he knew now that it was then that he first realized she had a life that no one else had seen. A life where she had saved people, tended the wounded, pulled people out of hell. He told how he learned from military archives, already a teenager, that in Iraq, his mother was in charge of a mobile hospital that came under fire. The hospital was temporary, deployed for a few hours in an open area between two hills. When the mortar fire began, all the staff had to retreat. But Martha stayed behind. Alone. Bandaging, sheltering, pulling on those who couldn't crawl. Of the 18 people in the tent, all survived. No one wrote about it in the newspapers. It wasn't on the news. And when she returned home, no one greeted her with flowers. He also told how for years she worked at a veterans hospital. Quietly, no big words. No thanks. No complaints. Just kept doing what she thought was right. Helping, healing, holding my hand. And at home she was just a mom. She made eggs, screamed if he forgot to take out the trash, and fell asleep with a book on her chest. The audience listened with bated breath. Even the guard next to Martha now looked uncomfortable. He no longer touched her but stood by her side, his gaze lowered. The volunteers didn't move. Some of the parents in the front rows clutched each other's hands, not knowing how to react. And James continued to stand on the stage and stare toward the back of the auditorium. Into the eyes of the one he was telling about. He finished simply. Without pathos. He said, "I'm not here today because I did well in school. And I'm not here because I earned it. I'm here because of a man who stood in the shadows all his life. A man who never demanded applause. My mother." The hall froze. Not from shock, not from scandal. From the feeling that they were only now realizing who they'd overlooked. James walked down the stage, past the administration, past the vice principal, past the security guard who took a step back as if giving way. He walked over to his mother, took her hand, and led the way. People stepped aside. No words, no orders. They just gave way. Because now they knew she hadn't just come. She was back where she belonged. In the evening, as the heat began to subside and the golden light slid across the grass, the backyard of the house on the outskirts of Asheville was filled with the smell of coal smoke and the ringing of voices. Sausages crackled on the charcoal grill, a bowl of potato salad covered with foil stood nearby. On the wooden terrace someone had put a speaker, from which came old songs, not loudly, not intrusively, as if the music did not play but breathed with the people. Relatives, neighbors, two of James's friends from high school all sat on plastic chairs, drinking lemonade, discussing the ceremony. Kids were running around the yard, chasing each other, someone yelling, "Don't go behind the tree, there are ants in there." Martha sat a little apart from everyone else in an old wooden chair, with a plaid on her lap and a glass of water in her hand. Her face was calm, almost detached, like a person who has returned from a long journey but has not yet fully unpacked her suitcase of memories. Nearby, on a low table, was a black-covered album. Already started. James had brought it from home. He sat beside it on the terrace step, leaning his elbows on his knees, and flipped through the pages with cautious inquisitiveness. There were pictures he'd never seen before. Tents, a U.S. flag, dusty roads, faces you could tell by looking at them. These pictures were taken in a place where no one really smiled. James kept his head down when he asked, "Why didn't you ever tell me about this?" The question sounded soft, almost like a statement, but Martha heard it clearly. She took a sip of water, waited, as if assessing whether the question deserved an answer, and then answered. Quietly. "Because it was more important for me to listen than to speak." There was no resentment in her voice, no bitterness, just the weariness of a woman who had lived many lives in one. James continued leafing through. A thin white paper fell out between the pages of the album. Folded neatly in half, the paper was aging around the edges. He unfolded it. Handwritten and signed, but in confident, crisp handwriting. "You didn't just save my life. You changed my soul. Nothing else. No date, no name. Just one phrase, more powerful than hundreds of speeches of gratitude." He read it aloud. Martha nodded silently. "I didn't save. I did what I knew how to do," she said. As if she didn't need that thanks or recognition. Just the very essence of the action itself. At that moment there was the sound of tires on gravel. A car, dark in color, slowly pulled into the back driveway. Not new, not old, just an ordinary SUV. But the air in the yard suddenly changed. The conversations began to subside. James looked up, the parents of the neighbors stopped chewing. Even the kids stopped, instinctively sensing that something was approaching that couldn't be touched but had to be respected. The car doors opened. 3 men stepped out. One leaned on a cane, the second was tall, with thick gray hair, and the third was in a wheelchair. They wore no uniforms, no insignia, just plain clothes, tired eyes, and a posture that did not forget what discipline is. They approached in silence, not looking around, not wondering who was looking at them. Their gaze was fixed on one point only, on Martha. The people parted. The conversations died down completely. They turned off the music, not even remembering who had turned it on. The men stopped in front of her. For a few seconds no one spoke. James jumped up, but Martha put her hand on his shoulder, calmly, confidently, and he froze. One of the men, the one with the cane, stepped forward. His voice was hoarse as if cut through time and dust. "Did you think we'd forgotten?" She didn't answer. Only looked him straight in the eye. And that was enough. This was not a visit out of courtesy. Not a thank you. It was a test of a bond that the years had not broken. Acknowledgement not by loud words, but by the very fact of their presence. They didn't come to speak. They came to stand. And they stood. Against the sunset sky, against the backdrop of children's laughter, against the backdrop of a family who realized for the first time who they were to the survivors. Dawn was rising slowly over the hills of Asheville, painting the sky with pale pink strokes, as if the painter were carefully touching the canvas with a barely damp brush. The air was cool, with the faintest hint of morning dew, and the whole place seemed to hold its breath. The city was still asleep. No dogs barking, no sound of cars. Only bird song, barely audible, like a memory of something distant but not forgotten. Martha sat on the porch of a small one-story house, with peeling paint on the railing and a wooden "Welcome Home" sign hanging by the door. In her hands was a coffee mug as old as the rest of the house. White with blue trim, a little cracked at the handle but still comfortable. She sat up straight as she always did, even now, wearing a gray cardigan over a t-shirt and soft house pants. Her gaze was staring off into the distance, to where the road turned behind the trees, still hidden by the morning fog. There were no thoughts, no worries. Only a sense that something else was about to happen. She wasn't waiting. She was just ready. Because in so many years Martha had learned to recognize the breath of the moment. And she recognized it again, that subtle before the important. The sound of tires on gravel was almost inaudible. A car appeared from around the corner like a shadow, rolling gently down the rocky driveway. A large SUV. No license plates. No stickers. No hint of ownership. It stopped exactly where the other one had pulled in last night. The doors opened almost in sync. 10 men stepped out of the car. No uniforms. One in a short-sleeved shirt, another in an old jeans jacket, some in leather boots, some barefoot. But there was something in common in each of them. The gait. Straight, confident, quiet. The kind you don't learn in civilian life. They walked in silence. Not one of them said a word. Neither one looked back. Neither one held a camera or a phone. Just a presence. And a look. They lined up at the foot of the porch. 10 people. Different ages, different builds, with different lives behind them. But each with a story. A story in which Martha was the point of return. They stood up. And froze. For a few seconds no one moved. Then, as if on cue, 10 right hands went up. Synchronized. Clearly. No fuss. Fingers extended, elbows level, palms pressed together. Salute. Not by the book. Respect. A salute not for Martha but for who she was to them. And who she still was. Martha set the mug on the railing carefully. Not in a hurry. Then she rose slowly. Her movements were no longer quick, but there was no weakness in them, only dignity. She straightened up, lifted her chin. And raised her hand. Not as an officer. Like a man who'd lived his life without loud words. Her palm slid to his temple and froze there, as if touching a shadow of the past. Their gazes met. No smiles. No dramas. Just a look like a password only their own people know. One of the men, the one standing closest, stepped forward. In his hands a small wooden box. Dark, polished, with a simple lock. He didn't go up on the porch. Just set the box down by the first step. Carefully. There's a note on top. Small, folded in half. He didn't say a word. Just nodded. Then he got back in line. They stood there for a few more seconds. Then they started to turn around. Not at the same time. Not fast. But confidently. They got into the car as silently as they'd gotten out. The doors slammed shut with a thud. The engine rumbled, and the wheels skidded across the gravel again until the car disappeared behind the trees. Martha walked over to the box. Squatted down as if she didn't feel the age. Took it in her hands. Took out the note. She read it. There was only one sentence. Now she was back where she belonged. She knew what she was talking about. The medal that disappeared in 2006. When, in the panic of evacuation, no one thought about things. Only lives. She opened the box. The medal lay in the center on dark velvet. Heavy. Real. Silent. Like a memory. She stood up. She held the box to her chest, and just stood there, until the sun rose a little higher, until the rays touched her face. Everything around her was coming alive. The birds were singing louder. The yard was waking up. And Martha stood, without words, no witnesses, just stood there, and held in her heart what she never asked for back. On the screen is the final shot. Martha against the sunrise, swaying slightly in the morning breeze. And the caption: "True strength is not in being seen. It's about staying true to yourself, even when no one is looking." Dear viewers, thank you for being with us. Subscribe to the channel, like us, and be sure to write in the comments what you think of this story. Don't forget to click on the bell, so you don't miss new interesting stories. See you soon.